Tēnā koe, hene rangi, koutou katoa, just waiting for, my slides, waiting for my slides to come up, ka pai. Thank you, tech team. So it's a real privilege to open the hui and to provide some framing and some context for how we might enter this conversation as a collective. So as I've said earlier, I'm a founding trustee, director of the Papawhakaritorito Charitable Trust. Papawhakaritorito is the name of our whānau food farm here in Kaituki, just out of Wellington, beautifully gifted to us by Huirangi many years ago when I was talking with him about what we were doing. He said, have you got a name for your farm? And we said, oh, Papawhakaritorito, that sounds like what you're doing. And I understand that as regenerative, Papawhakaritorito. As I mentioned earlier, I'm recovered from the white institutions of academia and the deep experiences of racism in the tertiary sector that I know many of our Māori academics face. And I'm now self-employed, working as a writer, a kaupapa Māori researcher, and a food and a soil activist, and also to a Hua Parakore whānau food grower up here. Sorry, whānau, I'm just putting my timer on so that I am not the one that goes over time, right? So a lot of my work is in the space of what I call kai atua, and you can see it behind me on the Hua Parakore banner. It's really what our kaumatua and Te Waka Kai Ora talked about as kai, as the Hua Parakore. You know, if you practice the Hua Parakore principles, ka puta mai ngā kai atua. So our work is about deepening our connection with the diverse realms of the atua and then producing kai atua. I'm also too involved, and I'll share this quickly, in a 3-year research project with my partner Jo Smith, who's also too a researcher, that is called Kai Atua Food for Hope and Wellbeing, funded by the Royal Society after about 3 or 4 times over the last decade trying to get some funding. And this is a 3-year study to try and understand what Māori food systems are. Because as I said earlier, this area is very under-researched. There's ad hoc investment and a little bit of initiatives here. We'll buy some wheelbarrows and some gardening tools here and support marae that way. You know, there was a TPK fund, Māori Kai fund that did that. But nothing's happening at scale. And we're looking at things again in silos. So what the Kai Atua project is looking at doing is understanding what our Māori food systems are so that we can return, as I've talked about in Te Mahi Mara Hua Parakore, so that we can return to eat our cultural landscapes again. And again, acknowledgements to Johnson for beautiful artwork in the Kai Atua project. We actually working with him to bring kaupapa Māori visual design into play so that we can communicate not just in the written word and research words, but actually through the images as well. This is an image that Johnson has developed for us coming off a previous project called Story in Kaitiakitanga, where we interviewed diverse Māori food producers, kiwi fruit producers, kumara, honey, rongoa practitioners, people who are wild harvesting kai as well. And the kai atua work and the Hua Parakore work is all situated within this woven universe, as Māori Marsden would say. And it really, when I look at this image, I see our cultural foodscapes connected by stars through to the soil. And it is about reviving tūpuna gardening practices and again, growing, thriving Māori food communities. I mean, how often have we all been in the mara where we are the ones actually doing the weeding or doing the harvesting or sowing the seeds or pricking out and potting up, and we're doing it on behalf of a collective, but actually we might be the only one there doing it, or there might just be 2 or 3 people. So how do we actually restore thriving Māori food communities? And this is where I think the link with kura kaupapa, with Koanga with our hauora entities is really important, because those whanaungatanga networks are already established. So what we're doing here in establishing thriving Māori food communities is we're deliberately situating them outside of capitalist economies and the ways in which capital flows, both in the global economy, but also too in a domestic economy. We're closing the loop essentially. You can see there's no loops in this image, and very deliberate about that. You know, closing the loop is really important so that we're not bringing in inputs, so that we can reduce our dependency on products and inputs that rely on oil that are imported from overseas. We can, you know, we're very aware, aren't we, with the war in Ukraine, which, by the way, has some of the world's best topsoil. So that's why it's called the food basket of Europe. Literally 1.5 meters of incredibly rich topsoil, and very heartbreaking not only to think about what's going on in the war over there and the effect on whānau, but also to the effect on Hiniahuone and the impact that that war is having on probably the most productive lands in all of Europe. Granted, it's growing monocultures at scale and it's using inputs, but we have the most amazing soils in the Ukraine with war going on top of them right at the moment. One of the other things that's really important in a kaiatua Hua Parakore system is this idea of drawing down carbon. So we have a legacy load of carbon in the atmosphere, not just carbon that we're emitting now, but carbon that's been emitted from previous decades. We call it a legacy load. So the ability of the soil to actually draw down and sequester carbon is a key part of a kaiatua or Hua Parakore food system. And of course, restoring biodiversity. So if we, you know, we're in this hui where, you know, the focus and the speakers are talking about cultivated foods, talking about horticulture predominantly. But if we think about that phrase, returning to eat our cultural landscapes are locked up in the conservation estate. 31% of Aotearoa is behind the management of the Department of Conservation to Papawhakaritorito. And so we are actually prohibited from returning to eat our cultural landscapes because of current colonial legislation. And in that same regard, we know that there's a huge decline in biodiversity around the motu. And I know some of you online are doing amazing work in pest management, and this is ongoing. But this is all part of the conversation. How do we return to eat from the ngahere, to eat from the awa, and to eat from the moana? So I really want to acknowledge Teresa Reihana first, who's been for this beautiful image, which we use all the time in Te Waka Kai Ora, along with all of the other beautiful images that she passed over to Matua Pusi and Te Waka Kai Ora to help to kōrero about our kaupapa. And for many of us Māori, this is not tangata whenua. We are people of the land. And this image for me explains Te Waka Kai Ora's kaupapa. You know, it explains that our role is to be co-creators and nurturers of the whenua of our food systems. And so, you know, the question I pose to all of you is, how do you actually change your standpoint in the mara or producing food to become a co-creator with nature? And one of the things that has happened for me over the years is that my observation skills have been heightened through being on the same piece of land for, you know, 15, 17 years. And so when we're on the land, listening, not talking too much, but just being, we have this opportunity to connect in with a different energy that allows us to express the Hua Parakore. And so the Hua Parakore, I'm not going to talk about it too much because I know Hini Maru and Lionel are coming up next, and we have Pounamu talking later on today, but these are ngā kaupapa o te Hua Parakore. We literally did, as Pounamu said, went around the motu for a few years and, you know, asked the pātai, he ahanga tino kaupapa o te Hua Parakore. And we had hundreds, as you could imagine. And bless our kaumatua, because they boiled it down for us, all of us younger ones, or I was younger 10, 15 years ago. we're finding it really hard to kind of see the wood for the trees. And mama no iho whā matua, and ka puta mai ngā kaupapa o te Hua Parakore. Again, just coming back to that point, you know, how do we express the Hua Parakore in our gardening practices? And yes, it is about reviving tūpuna gardening practices, but for me, and I think probably having spent, being blessed to spend time with Matua Percy, it's about coming back to our divine senses as Indigenous beings, as co-creators and co-nurturers with nature. So taking that step back, going softly, listening, being acute to our senses. Again, acknowledgements to Teresa for this beautiful artwork that we use in Te Waka Kai Ora. But as many of you will know, you know, we put this book out in 2020, Te Mahi Oni Oni Hua Parakore, a Māori Soil Sovereignty and Wellbeing Handbook. Came about because, you know, a lot of people ask the pātai, I really want to grow food. How do I grow food? And so it often starts above the ground, the conversation. But really, as food growers, we know that growing kai starts below the ground. But we have to reconnect with our Indigenous senses to kind of understand what we need to do below the ground and what those relationships are. So what I really love about this book is that it's a diverse collection of kōrero from Māori across the motu who've been thinking deeply about soil and soil sovereignty and soil security. So, you know, I often ask the question, how can we elevate the mana of Hiniahuoni? We know in Aotearoa we've had the whanganui and the uruweras being returned to personhood status, being given personhood status, which really changes legislatively and also to, in a practical sense, how those natural resources or how those tūpuna are treated and what we do on them and who actually has governance over them. What if we were to return personhood status to Hiniahuoni? How then would we tread lightly on her? As I wrote in the soil book, soil is our silent ally in the food system. And no one speaks up for her. Very little people speak up for Hiniahuoni. And so it is our job to give voice to the degradation, the very fast, rapid degradation of soils in Aotearoa. We can see with infrastructure development, you know, we live just out of Wellington, driving over Transmission Gully, breaks your heart when you see concrete that has a very high carbon footprint being laid down. So how do we balance these competing priorities? We've also too been working to develop the Hua Parakore as a kaupapa Māori framework for soil health. So, you know, you'll know for those of you who have read this book that actually we have Hua Parakore framed up questions to help us think about reconnecting our relationship with the soil. So what are the pūrākau in your rohi from your whānau in relation to soil? How can you reclaim those pūrākau? How can you enhance the mauri of the soil? And how, again, can you be that co-creator and that nurturer, co-creator and that nurturer of Hiniahuoni, but te ao tūroa. So our contemporary food systems currently really require us as Indigenous people to eat colonial landscapes in our everyday. So we have had enough, haven't we, in the education system in terms of white history being taught. And now we're seeing a sea change towards our histories being taught to rangatahi in schools around Aotearoa. But actually in our foodscapes, we're eating colonisation every day. The whiteness in our food system from refined sugars, refined flours, refined grains, is just, I don't know if it's something that really comes to the forefront, you know, and when we walk into wharekai or we look on the table of kai, firstly, I have to say that with so much food insecurity around, I don't want to detract from the fact that actually it's fantastic that people have food, because having nutrients and nourishment is obviously vital for living. but we need to re-look, we need different lenses to look at what is on the table and to actually see the colonial foodscapes that sit right in front of us that we consume in our everyday. And I love Winona LaDuke from Turtle Island, Indigenous activist who kōrero around, you know, you control oil, you control nations, you control food, and you control people. So when our people have to go and seek the support of food banks, our people then are not in control of their food system. So this is why I'm going to keep coming back throughout this hui to this idea of scaling up Māori food farms in urban and rural settings so that our people are not having to access food banks, which is conventional food. You know, it's still eating colonial landscapes. But again, I acknowledge that it's nourishment and it's really important, but we really need to start to rebuild our own food systems. So I just want to touch very quickly on the state of the global food system, because we're having a domestic conversation across rohe and iwi and hapu and whānau over the next 2 days around what do we want to do differently and how can we join up. But actually we don't have domestic sovereignty in Aotearoa, and we know that through the neoliberal agreements that the government signs, often without Māori participation, and so that's why 2522 that has been filed with the Waitangi Tribunal, putting MFAT on notice for working outside of treaty partnerships around its international agreements. So this is why it's really important to understand the global food system, because we might agitate for rangatiratanga mana motuhake and enact it in our local spaces, but actually we need to understand what we're pushing against, what we want to do differently with the food systems. So at the moment, you know, rapid growth, population growth, just going to be exploding, urbanisation all around the world, people's leaving rural areas, moving into the cities because the nature of work, especially for subsistence farmers, is really changing. We've got growing wealth and inequalities, as we know, and then we have war and conflict. Post-World War II, with the use of Agent Orange as a chemical weapon by America in Vietnam, we know at the end of World War II that there was the excess of chemical agents had then found their way into our food system. So there are images in Aotearoa of Agent Orange being sprayed, aerial sprayed over our whenua. So I'm raising this because I'm really concerned and very alert to what will emerge during the war in the Ukraine and post the war in the Ukraine as well, in terms of the industry of war and the manufacturing of weapons, to then moving into the manufacturing of chemicals and other new technologies that then move into our food and our agricultural systems, because we've seen that happen before. And this is where those neoliberal flows of capitalism and the way the global economy works, it repeats itself. So let's learn from some of those patterns from the past and be on high alert for what is coming during this war era. Important also too to make the connection between the multinationals who produce the weapons for war and the agri-chemical companies. Very, very, very close, very close. You'd need to do some really good research to peel back all those layers to find those corporate connections, which are often hidden through those neoliberal flows. So our global food system colonised Indigenous people's consumption patterns. You know, we can see this in Aotearoa, you can really see it in the Pacific Islands as well, which New Zealand is culpable in, because we export some of our fattiest cuts of meat over to the Pacific, which increases the rate of non-communicable diseases amongst Pacific peoples. So our food systems have become monocultured, which just means, you know, singular. They've become very singular. And there's a lack of diversity in them. Oh my gosh, you know, you go to the supermarket, there's 2 varieties of lettuces, but if you're a grower, you know, there's hundreds of varieties of lettuces and radicchios and things that we can be planting. So we are literally importing whiteness. We know our food systems are contributing to and affected by climate change. This 1 in 100, you know, weather event is just not cutting the mustard anymore, is it? And we can see it up on the East Coast where there's been 2 massive weather events impacting predominantly Māori communities. And then, of course, land degradation and biodiversity loss. Still driving around the motu in Aotearoa and seeing our waterways not fenced from cattle and wondering why that is still happening. So how do we respond to this? Like, what do we need to do? What the FAO tells us, what my research tells us, and where I'm heading, you know, where we're heading in our research, is that we need to take a systems-based approach, because there's so many complexities in the food system that we need that big view to look at it. And we need to look at it through our holistic and sustainable eyes, where Indigenous peoples are placed at the centre. So if our food system in Aotearoa is not serving Indigenous peoples, then it's not serving anybody. You know, we know that we have to look after the people in our communities in most need. And I'd say the same thing for our food system. Our food system needs to be feeding our people first and foremost. But actually what we see with organic agriculture in New Zealand, it's the worried well and the wealthy and the white and Pākehā people who are actually benefiting from chemical and pesticide-free food because of the price point. So this is why growing Hua Parakore free from pesticides and chemicals and GE is really important in regrowing our food systems. So other threats to food and soil sovereignty, I've already talked about the neoliberal global food circuits. You know, the wicked problem, you've got to think about the convergence, so the coming together of climate change with peak oil and food insecurity, as Vandana Shiva talks about it, is a wicked problem. So this is not even on our doorstep, it's in the whare, it's in the whare right now. And then technological fixes such as GE for food production, you know, really deeply altering our relationship with nature, but also too, we really do not have the risk management frameworks to even know what questions to ask around the impacts of GE. And then, of course, the erosion of biodiversity and traditional food growing practices. We know that there's a strong correlation between the loss of biodiversity, flora and fauna, and the loss of Indigenous knowledge, mātauranga Māori. So if we continue to see the decline of biodiversity in Aotearoa, if Māori continue to be locked out by the Crown from the conservation estate to be able to return to eat our cultural landscapes, that there will be an impact on mātauranga Māori, because we won't be able to practice it because those species will have disappeared. So our love affair with chemical inputs in Aotearoa just seems to continue, you know, the MPK philosophy, let's keep adding more and adding more. And you can see on the blue part of that graph there, just the increase in nitrogen use in Aotearoa. So this is from the FAO website. You know, we do have to report as a country internationally to the about the level of chemical inputs, but we're in a food crisis. It's a global food and soil emergency, and we're still putting inputs on the soil. So really, we want to turn this graph the other way and to see this heading in the direction downwards. So there's so much to say in this space about GE, and if I have the opportunity, I will keep coming back to it throughout the hui. I've worked in this space, as I mentioned. I first came to Te Waka Kai Ora in this space because I was looking for like-minded people and a movement to join up with to oppose GE in food and our environment. And also to want to acknowledge the rōpū ngā wahine tiaki o te ao. I can see Teddy Harrison's online as well. But an amazing rōpū of wahine Māori, mana wahine, who stood up at the Royal Commission and very clearly said, as mana wahine, as kaitiaki of our whānau and of our whenua, we are saying no to GE in food and our environment. We had a Royal Commission 20 years ago in New Zealand where Māori who submitted had a resounding no to GE in the environment. And yet the debate at the moment is again being reconstructed with the idea that there's this kind of fake emerging social license that New Zealand is open again for business around genetic engineering and genetic technologies. Just to clarify, we don't have GE in release in New Zealand. So the GE work that's going on is happening predominantly in our CRIs and with private industry, and obviously all regulated by the EPA, by the Environmental Protection Authority. But what is of real concern to me and to Te Waka Kai Ora is that we're going to have to spend our time again saying the same things about genetic engineering and putting our hand up and saying, no, actually, that's it. It's, you know, that this is not Hua Parakore. It doesn't mean that we're Luddites. It doesn't mean that we don't understand innovation. I have a PhD in science. I did my doctorate in this area. I can talk about genetics, you know, for a day. But what we have is we have the domination of Western scientific viewpoint that has its origins in very reductionist and mechanistic sciences being privileged in the debate. So you won't see Māori in the debate, I think, in the media unless we're sitting on the fence and providing an opportunity to open the can of worms around that social license. So GE technologies have the, you know, they're not really there to serve the communities, they're there to make money for multinationals. We know when a novel organism or a new organism is created through genetic technologies, either by moving the gene sequence within an organism or transgenically across an organism, that a novel product has been created under an intellectual property rights system that then gets patented. And then the patent rights and the profit goes back to the companies, back to the multinationals. So this is not a technology where we derive benefits from. Don't have enough time to talk about the impacts of GE on tikanga, but I'm just really flagging, you know, from my viewpoint, from the viewpoint of Ngā Wahine Tiaki o Te Ao, of Te Waka Kai Ora, GE impacts whakapapa, Māori, mana, and the wairua of Te Aotearoa. And I just say again and again and again, we have to stand up, and it's coming, and we'll see it over the next year or 2 years, especially around the conversation about GM ryegrasses being a, you know, potential mitigation for climate change. So, as I've said, we want to return to eat our cultural landscapes. And so what I want to do just in the last part of my presentation, I'm looking at my time team, I won't be more than 4 minutes here, is I want to move into solutions focus, because that's you know, what I've done in that first part of the presentation is hopefully set up a bit of the international and the domestic context. But actually now I want to move into that space of opportunity and solution. Whereas Vandana Shiva says, you know, I'll leave that to you guys to read the quote, but it's about diversity, and it's about communities, and it's about being co-creators and nurturers. It's about observation skills, reconnecting with our divine senses. So I just quickly want to finish just by taking you all through a polycropping story of what we've been doing in our māra, because we can talk about the politics and the critical issues, but actually what keeps us grounded at the farm is getting outside and being in the māra. So what you're looking at here is the establishment of a new māra, and you know, starting a new garden bed is often where we can make our first mistakes. Sighting for sun, thinking about wind, thinking about proximity to the house, to the garden shed, all of that stuff. So where that weed matters is the area where we've started a new māra, and it's probably only about 20 metres away from the house. What we've done is we're using a weed mat suppression technique here to kill the grass off and to not disturb the soil. So we're not tilling, we're not getting a rotary hoe in there. We've just put the weed mat down for a couple of months to allow the grass to die. And why we did that is because we had a soil test done and we found that our soil was really high in organic matter, which sounds awesome, and it's probably as a result of me putting on 500 biodynamic preparation, 500 for over a decade. But what that meant is that the soil microbiology was really sleepy. So it was all sitting there, but it needed to be stimulated and woken up. So what we did, whoops, wrong button, was whoops, too many wrong buttons, was we decided to plant a cover crop. And this is the mata after we took the weed mat off. So it kind of looks like it's been sprayed with Roundup, but it hasn't. The weed mat is breathable so that we're not actually killing the soil microbiology, but we're just killing that root structure of that grass that was on top. We then planted a cover crop on there. So you can see the seed mix in here. It was a mixture of about 5 seeds, but then we all got a little bit excited and were broadcasting a whole lot of more seeds in there, which probably impacted on what we did. But the advice was for 5 seeds. So I think, you know, you've got ryegrass, you've got blue lupins, you've got sunflower, daikon, really deep rooting. And so it's this idea as above as below. So when we grow diversity above the soil, then we can think about what's going on under the soil, because then you've got root structures at different levels. You've got some roots producing different types of exudates or soil nutrients. And that's really what we were trying to do with the cover crop, was to reinvigorate, you know, to turn on the on button of the soil microbiology, which was all sitting there with, you know, we had good organic matter, as I said earlier, but it was all just a bit sleepy. So we broadcast the cover crop after the weed mat, and then we, you know, you can see the growth after 4 weeks. Cover crop at 2 months, growing up, looking really lovely and lush. And then terminating the bed after 4 months. So terminating it by hand, they're just using a little knee washi, not pulling out the roots, so leaving all the roots under the ground because we don't want to disturb the soil, and then that cover crop just gets laid down as mulch. And then planting out seedlings, but as I said, we're polycropping, so it's multiple crops, so things are planted really, really, really close. And instead of pulling things out of the soil, we're literally cutting them off at the soil level and just allowing things to drop. So a little bit like syntropic farming, which we've got a session with Jared later on in the Hui, who will be able to talk in more detail about this. This is Lani, who's also talking in the Hui later on as well. And so this is Lani planting out our rua bed. So you can just see that first line of lettuces going in, you know, and we've got kohlrabi, we've got brassicas going in there, I've got chamomile along the paths. And this is where we are now. So, you know, this is 4 or 5 months on and the gardens are pumping. We've done no damage to the soil and we're listening and we're observing really, really closely. So polycropping, how can we scale it up? How can we grow food at scale? How can we set up Māori food farms? Okay, I'm just going to have to rush through these because I cannot be hold this lovely hui up. So what's a sustainable kaiatua Māori food system? Driven by us, for us, stepping off that capitalist food system to becoming producers and connectors again of our own food systems, connected at place with whānau and community, contributing to soil and food sovereignty. Have to feed our whānau first. If we can't feed our whānau first, then what are we doing? And it's about diversity on all levels. So not just biodiversity, but diverse Māori economies. What are the different types of micro enterprises that we can set up in the diverse economic models that we can engage in? And of course, it's intergenerational. So I'm very interested in our rangatahi, you know, growing rangatahi food farmers. Where are the pathways to onboard, the kaupapa Māori pathways to onboard our rangatahi? And I know Papatūānuku Marae are doing awesome work in that space. So again, pathways forward, food farms, connect up across the silos. And for me, this is my politics, you know, declarations on GE out of our food and the environment. Because if we don't put ourselves at the forefront of this conversation, Pākehā science and Pākehā media will just have this conversation without us. So it requires really, really, really active resistance. And finally, Mihi to Johnson for the kaupapa Māori design work, to Teresa for the artwork to explain the Hua Parakore standpoint, and also to the He Whenua Rongo kaupapa Māori research team for just helping us get to this point. So I'll just leave it at there. It feels like that was a very quick whirlwind. It's a very complex, you know, if we think about food systems, they're very complex, but then if we come back to kaupapa Māori, it's so simple because it's who we are and it's how we come to know ourselves. Nō reira koutou, mihi atu kia koutou. This is a whirlwind, sorry, Hanerangi.